Hi, this is Chris German from the Apartment Dealer, bringing you another segment here where we go out into the marketplace and speak to those professionals that have applicable knowledge when it comes to the various facets of owning commercial real estate. Today, we have with us Mr. Greg Burns. Greg, for 2 decades now, has worked with IPX1031 Exchange Services, which is a qualified intermediary. And we're going to discuss what does that mean. But we're going to talk exchanges. If you've been to any of my educational events, you know that I discuss 3 pillars of owning commercial real estate. The first being maximization, the second being growth, and 1031 exchanges have everything to do with growing your net income, growing the size of your portfolio, and so forth. So Greg, thank you for being with me today. So accommodator, we use these terms interchangeably, but what does IPX do? Why are they necessary in the exchange process?
So when Section 1031 came down, one of the rules that they came out with is that the client can't have any control of the money during the exchange process. And so they created kind of this qualified intermediary that can kind of facilitate the exchange transaction. So basically what we do is we assign into the exchange and keep the client within constructive receipt of the funds, which means that they can't have any control of the money. So we assign into escrow on their sale before escrow closes. When escrow closes, the proceeds from the sale come over to us and are held in trust for the customer. And then they have, the identification period and the other period they have to close on their property. But the idea behind a qualified intermediary is basically to, keep the client away from constructive receipt of the funds.
So if I sell my apartment building or my property, I can't take the money out of escrow. I have to utilize a company like yours.
Right. Yeah. And you have to get assigned in before escrow closes. So we have had some unfortunate incidents where I've gotten phone calls from a client that says, "Hey, Greg, I want to get an exchange set up." And I said, "Where are you at in the process?" And they said, "Well, I'm ready to go." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And they said, "Well, I closed on my property, yesterday. I got my check today. What do I do now?" And unfortunately, as you know, because of your years in the business, at that point, it's too late, right? So you need to get us assigned in the transaction earlier in the process.
And are 1031 exchange accommodators, are they all the same? Because there's different ones with different fees. What sets accommodators apart?
So, it's always interesting to me when somebody calls me up and says, "What's your fee?" And I say, "Okay, we charge a fee of, $850, right?" And they say, "Oh, okay, thanks." I say, "Well, do you have any other questions?" And they say, well, no. And I say, "Well, are you at all concerned about who's holding on to your money?" Right? Sure. Our industry is completely unregulated. You don't have to be licensed or bonded. So one of the important questions when you're choosing a qualified intermediary, the most important questions are, who are you? How are you protecting my money? How long have you been in business? What kind of expertise do you have? And so, we're wholly owned by the largest title insurance company in the country, Fidelity National Financial. They provide your customers with a $50 million performance guarantee. We have $100 million in a Fidelity bond. We've got $30 million in Arizona emissions coverage. We have 27 years of experience of doing these exchanges, and I've been with the company for 20 years. So the client can have some comfort in the fact that we're going to be there when it's time to get their deal closed.
Right, sure. And for argument's sake, I remember in 2007, and you can remind me of the company, but there was a company during the financial collapse, a 1031 exchange company that went bankrupt. And those individuals that that had entrusted them with their money was seized for some time.
So there was a title insurance company called Land America that basically invested the money in an instrument called an auction rate security. And when the market was good, they'd take money in and out, and it was no problem. But when Lehman collapsed and the markets froze, those securities had a maturity date of 24 years. And so obviously, if you only have 180 days to complete your exchange, being able to get your money out before the 24-year deal was a significant deal.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, if the exchange company goes down or your money's nowhere to be found, the IRS still expects an exchange, yet you'll have no money, and you'll have gains to pay, and it's just
right. So you've got, you've sold the property, you've received a 1099 from escrow saying that you sold this property, and there's X amount of gain, and the government's going to want their money. So it's a significant hit for sure. So you definitely want to be sure that price isn't always an issue. There's people that charge as little as $500 and as much as $1,500, but always most important to make sure that, who you're using has the sufficient guarantees in place to make sure your money is safe.
With regards to 1031 exchanges, now not everyone is a candidate. You would need an exchange analysis to determine, is it a viable option for you based upon your equity? Can you really gain in terms of income? When we were to do an analysis on your net equity, with your current rate of return in the building that you own, that you're contemplating a sale, versus what you could anticipate receiving from the next property, your next up leg, as we call it. So that being said, for those that maybe are less familiar, the exchange process, if you could just, everyone knows you have 180 days to essentially finish the exchange, but what encompasses that 180 days?
Yeah, so the most challenging part of an exchange by far is that 45-day identification period. So from the date that escrow closes, you have 45 days to identify a replacement property, and there's some rules that you have to comply with. So it's very important that when you do an exchange, the key, as you well know, is advanced planning, right? Is that you go into the process with a plan in place that's executable, right? So some of the clients that could get into trouble with the 45 days, their challenge is that they sell an asset purely because it's highly appreciated, right? And so they're out in the market, they have not come up with a plan. The broker just told them that, hey, my property's worth $5 million. I bought it for $1 million. I've got to sell it. It's gone up that much in value. So they didn't do an analysis like you're talking about. And then they're out now looking for property. And what happens is that they realize that everything else out there is also very expensive. And so they call me up and they say, oh, I'm having such trouble finding a new property. Everything out there is so expensive. And I say, well, did you get a lot of money for the property you sold? They say, well, yeah, that's why I sold it. And so it's important that you go into it with a plan, right? And you got to make sure that the plan is an executable one. And what I mean by that is that I had a client sold a property one time, really wanted to buy an apartment building in Santa Barbara. Well, there's not a lot of apartments trading in Santa Barbara, right? So, if you would have had been that, customer's, advisor, you probably would have told them, listen, we can buy something in that market, but maybe not in Santa Barbara. It might be in Goleta, maybe Ventura, because there's not a lot of deals that trade. So they're very important that you go into the exchange process in that 45 days with a plan that's executable.
Now, I've had clients tell me who've used other accommodators that, well, I use a specific accommodator because they work with me on my 45-day timeline. I mean, what's the danger in that of these companies that apparently are out there that are fudging the date?
Yeah, so we call it the accommodating accommodator. So the challenge with that is that you're ultimately committing tax fraud, right? So if the very first thing that the IRS and the Franchise Tax Board will ask you in an audit, one of the very first documents they ask you for is that identification statement. And there was recently an exchange company who was notorious for backdating documents. They were a small company out of LA. And the IRS audited their office, not the client, but the actual exchange office. And what they found was a bunch of envelopes in these files that had time date stamps that showed that they sent these in on the 45th day, but there were no identification statements in there. And so what they did was they deemed that exchange company a disqualified intermediary, which means that it taints every transaction that they ever handled. So it's really important, and I know it can be tough. The 45 days goes by very quickly, but it's, people will always say, well, I know the 45 days is not a big deal. I just got to close them in 180, right? We don't report anything to the IRS. We're not, the exchange police. But at the same token, if you get audited, they are going to ask for that, right? And if I, let's say, identify a property that maybe wasn't on the market for 100 days after I closed on my sale, if I get an agent that actually looks at that and goes, well, how did this guy identify this property? It wasn't available till 60 days after his, 45th day. They look into it and find out that I was trying to lie to them. Then I'm in real big trouble, right? I'm knowingly trying to defraud the government, in a transaction. So always best to just kind of play above board.
And we had a real life client, this probably goes back maybe 5 years now, who wanted to go beyond the 45 days. We weren't comfortable with that, so he chose to work with another agent that apparently convinced him it was okay to do so. They bought a building that was not on the market during the 45-day window, that exact scenario, and his son, the owner's son, called us, I guess a year later, confused on who was the agent involved, and said, hey, I need the paperwork on that purchase because my dad's in an audit now.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm not the agent who facilitated that purchase. You have to speak with that agent. So that it does happen, something to be cognizant of. Now, the rules of finding the property. So the proper planning, we can discuss more at length. There's way to work with your escrow time frame so that you have plenty enough time for shop time to find the next buildings. But once you are into that 45-day window, how many properties can I pick? One property, 10, 100? How do I know how many properties I can choose? How many I have to close? How does that work out?
Yeah, there are 3 rules that you can use to identify properties. So the most common rule that people use is the 3-property rule. It doesn't limit the value of property you can identify. It limits the total number of properties to 3. So if I sell an asset for $2 million, I could identify 3 properties that were $3 million each. I could identify 2 properties that are $2 million each in the Brooklyn Bridge. Doesn't make a difference. The value of property that I identified under the 3-property rule doesn't matter, right? Most people that are selling one property and buying one property typically use the 3-property rule, right? But then there are cases where people are selling a larger asset and maybe they want to diversify. And so there's another rule called the 200% rule. And that rule says I can identify as many properties as I like as long as the total aggregate value is not more than twice the value of the property I sold. So if I sell a property for $2 million, I could identify up to $4 million worth of real estate. Well, that could be 10 $400,000 condos, in Florida or wherever you can find a $400,000 condo. But so you can use either of the rules. I always tell my clients, you don't need to identify property till the 45th day or day 44, right? Because what happens is we get clients that say, oh, I'm under contract on this deal. Let's say 2 weeks into it, I need to identify it. You don't need to identify it, right? Because if something happens, you go through your due diligence, maybe you don't like it, then then you have to rescind your original identification statement. So I just say, you might wait till the 45th day in order to identify.
And is it 5 o'clock on the 45th day?
It's midnight.
Midnight. Yeah. So to Greg's point, again, during this 45 days, you could be negotiating on infinite number of buildings technically, sure, and doing your walkthroughs, doing your inspections, looking at books and records, and you're going through this process. But come the 45th day, you have to whittle it down to either 3 properties, given rule number 1, or no more than 200% of the value of the property that you sold for rule 2. What's rule 3?
So rule 3 it's called the 95% exception. And it's very rarely used. And it basically says you can identify as many properties as you want, regardless of their value, but you have to buy 95% of everything you've identified. Mm. So typically you're going to identify 4 or more properties, because if you're identifying less than 4, you use a 3-property rule. And the total value of those properties is going to be more than twice the value of the property that you sold. And you basically have to buy everything you've identified. So it's typically, I've only seen it used like 5 or 6 times. It's very rarely used. So selling one property, buying one property, probably the 3-property rule. Mm-hmm. Selling one property, buying multiple properties, probably the 200% rule.
And in your experience, about 20 years, obviously investors have different needs. Have you seen some more creative ways to use the exchanges or scenarios so that it would fit either their estate planning or something else they were looking for?
Yeah, so we see lots of creative things people do with 1031. We had a client one time at a large office building in El Segundo. He came to me and said, listen, I'm just going to sell this building, pay my taxes, put my money in the bank. I've got 3 boys. And I know that if I keep this building, that they're just going to tear each other apart. And I don't want that to happen. I want them to, keep their relationships. And so I said, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you sell the building, do a 1031 exchange, give each son a budget that they can work with, and have them pick their own building. So, well, why should I have them pick their own building? They don't know a lot about real estate. I said, because if you pick the 3 assets and one outperforms the other 2, the other sons are going to feel like that they kind of got gypped. So he said, that's a great idea. So he did. So he sold his building. Each son identified a property that they wanted to purchase. They ended up using the 200% rule because I think he ended up identifying 5 properties. But So they closed on each of these 3 properties. He created a trust for each one after the fact, made that son the beneficiary and the trustee of the trust so they can run the property. And that way, when he passes away, the sons will get the property. They'll get a step up in basis. It'll eliminate the taxes, but it'll also eliminate any infighting because each individual son got to pick their own property. So if one of the properties outperforms the other one, it's nobody's fault but the son, right?
Now, so let's stay with this for a minute. So I think taking it a step further, if the father wanted the sons to start enjoying the income or a portion of the income, he actually could have them collect the monies and then pay them a management fee on the books while he's still the owner,
100%.
right?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And the other thing we're seeing people do is that as the baby boomer generation is getting older, one of the things they're looking to do, as retirement is they may not want to retire in California. Maybe it's very expensive to live here, or maybe they want to retire in a different part of California. Maybe they want to be in Palm Desert, Indian Wells, Rancho Mirage, those areas. And so they're selling assets off. Like I just had a client not that long ago. They sold an apartment building. It was $2.5 million. They took $500,000 of the 2.5 and used it to exchange into a home in La Quinta. And that home, they're going to hold it as a vacation investment property for a couple of years. The $2 million that was left over, they used it to buy traditional investment property. It was another apartment building. Mm-hmm. And then they said about 5 or 6 years down the road that they think what they're going to do is they're going to convert that property that they purchased in the desert into their retirement home. Mm-hmm. And they'll sell the property that they have here. We also see that baby boomer generation buying homes that their kids are renting out. And so, very expensive, obviously, you've got a lot of kids. I've got a lot of kids, right? As we see them get older, right, we look at the price values of real estate. We think, how are our kids ever going to afford to buy these houses, right? So what some of the parents are doing is they're selling off some of their investment property or an investment property and using the money, a portion of the money, or sometimes all of the money to buy a house that their son or daughter then lives in, and they pay them rent, right? And they hold it as an investment. They create a trust so that when they pass away, that the son or daughter will get that house and it'll be, their primary residence will be their home. So there's lots of interesting things that you can do with 1031. You can combine tax codes with Section 1031 with Section 121, the primary residency exclusion. So there's an infinite number of things.
So to that point, to draw the concept out a little further. So if I sell an apartment building and I take a portion of the proceeds and I buy a home that ideally, say I want to use as a vacation home down the road, I first must rent it out for 2 years. Is that correct? And then I can convert it?
So there's a revenue ruling out there that says any property that's held as an investment for 2 years or more in an audit, the IRS won't challenge the held for investment portion of the exchange, which means that as long as I hold it as an investment for at least 2 years, after that, I can pretty much do whatever I want with it. Now, a vacation home can qualify as an investment if it's used less than 2 weeks out of the year by the owner or less than 10% of the time it's been rented, right? So if you rent it out for 200 days, you can use it for 20, and you have to show at least 2 weeks of income on it. So you could actually have a vacation home. You could use it sparingly for the first couple of years, rent it out, make sure that you rent it out for at least 2 weeks a year. And then after that 2 years were up, you pretty much do whatever you want with it.
Oh, wow. So with the popularity of Airbnb, could I, again, sell an apartment building, buy a house, and a portion of the time it's Airbnb, and same idea, I can use it a portion of the time as well?
Absolutely. And any time that you spend in that home making improvements doesn't count against your 2 weeks. So if I used it as an Airbnb and then after it was done, I went out there and cleaned it and, fixed the leaky faucet or whatever, painted the bathroom or did some maintenance to it, it doesn't count against the 2 weeks that I get to spend there.
Okay.
So that's kind of
fixing that leaky faucet might take a week or so.
Yeah, right. But yeah, we do have clients that make lots of repairs to their property.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The greatest concern of an exchanger for someone who's pondering the idea is, hey, even if my building isn't the ideal asset, at least I know what I'm dealing with. And you're asking me to go into the unknown of, will I find a property? So in general, and I know, it's hard to gauge, but in general, do you have a big percentage of owners that you are coming to you and saying, oh, you know what, I just closed whatever, something I wasn't really happy with, but I just did it to suffice the exchange rules? Do you see a Because I think the vantage point of a lot of owners who have not gone through an exchange is that, well, you're just going to be stuck buying whatever. Do you see that really playing out?
There's a lot of misconceptions about exchanges, right? So I get emails from agents all the time, typically not great ones, who say, hey, I've got a great property for a 1031 client. And that is keyword for me that it's overpriced, right? So, and I always tell my customers that are in an exchange, so we complete 93% of our exchanges, right? So 93% of the deals that are open get completed, right? But there's a percentage of them or people that are not real sure that they're going to complete it anyway, right? So I have a couple clients right now that just opened deals and said, listen, I'm going to look for 45 days. If I find something I love, I'm going to buy it. And if I don't, I'm just going to go
either way,
right? But I always tell my customers, and I know you probably preach the same thing. If you don't find something that you really want to buy, let's not buy it, right? You never want to, and I very rarely have customers that go, oh, I just bought something because I didn't want to pay the taxes, right? I'm okay overpaying a little bit, right? So if I'm going to save 30% in taxes, if I got to pay, 3, 4, 5%,
sure,
more than I think it's worth, I'm okay with that as long as I like the property, right? And so that's what happens in most cases. I say in most cases, people are paying market. They're not even really paying over market. But you decide to pay a little more, I'd probably be, okay with it. But we're not seeing people that are just throwing themselves into property just to complete their exchange. And we complete a pretty high percentage of them. So I just don't think that's very realistic.
Very good. All right, Greg. Well, thank you for your time.
Thanks for letting me come in.
I hope this was helpful. I hope this information is insightful, helps you along your apartment multifamily ownership. Again, this is Chris German from The Apartment Dealer, wishing you positive cash flow, tenants who behave, and with the help of an accommodator, much protection from Uncle Sam. Until next time, thank you.